Hi everyone. I'm Megan Brown. I work at Newcastle University. I'm a senior research associate in medical education. I'm also ASME's Director of Communications and Social Media. And I'm really here in my capacity as a mentee. Um, with us intending this to be a conversation about the different roles, mentor, mentee. But I have also completed ASME's really excellent formal mentor training program. And I can see that Bob's put details in the chat about how you might be able to access that as well. So that's me. Yeah, Bob.
And hello, I'm Bob McKinley. I'm the director for career groups, and as part of that, that's why I've become involved with mentoring. I'm now retired. I'm an emeritus professor of education and general practice. And as part of my role, I've been interested in helping people and supporting people to develop both themselves and their careers. And for me, the origin of my interest in mentoring and making it more formal was that I was always concerned that getting access to mentorship was accidental. It was somebody you met in the queue for coffee, or the queue for lunch at a conference or a meeting, or you just happened to have a boss who was worried, or sorry, who was concerned and interested in your career. And what I wanted to do is try and take the chance out of that. So that's why we work towards setting up the mentorship program, which Megan's alluded to. And as Mike said, that we're here to have a conversation. So we're not here to deliver a didactic lecture. So,
thanks, Bob.
Anyone, any initial questions? We can always start off with questions we'd prepared earlier,
yes.
Which may, of course, completely miss the mark. Michael, would you like to ask us a question?
I was going to say questions that we hope people will ask, but so we've just asked them to ourselves anyway. I mean, I think you've touched on a couple of ideas, Bob, in your introduction, which are things that we sort of find ourselves spontaneously talking about when we talk about mentoring, in terms of what mentoring maybe is. And you'd started to talk there about it coming from someone who's maybe keen to help and so on. So what for you is mentoring as a process? And I've got the same question for Megan as well. What is mentoring, and is it important to maybe disambiguate it in terms of other similar looking processes, and so that we're clear about what it is and what it isn't?
Thanks, Mike. Mentoring's a difficult word. It's the word I've always used, but quite a few other people talk about coaching. And when they talk about coaching, what they mean is what I think about as mentoring. And for me, mentoring is where as a mentor, or when I was being mentored, was someone who took an interest in me and my future, didn't have the answers, but give me the space to talk about who I was and where I wanted to get to and how I could get there. And sometimes they may have a particular piece of advice, but more often what they did was help me sort out in my own head what it was that I wanted to do and clarify what I should be doing next. And sometimes making decisions that the clarification was that I didn't want to go there after all. And other times seeing different routes through the conversation, seeing different routes to get there. But when it really worked, it was when somebody made me think harder about myself.
Thanks, Bob. I could see you nodding, Megan. Did some of that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I understand it similarly, possibly because I've done the training that Bob's been involved in, of course. But I think I mean, I might add that I've been part of mentoring relationships that have been relatively informal, where you do sort of organically develop that go-to person, or that person that's helping you, learn the ropes in whatever situation you're in, whatever, maybe that's a new situation, a new job, a new role. Moving into medical education was, I definitely had a kind of go-to person that helped me navigate that transition from clinical practice into education. Or it can be more formal. I think I think there are benefits to both, and I definitely appreciated in those more formal settings, as Bob said, having someone who's not quite a mirror, but it definitely that kind of sense of having somebody to reflect back. Maybe, you know, phrases that you've used, challenge some of your assumptions, having that bit of a critical friend, or a kind of wise friend. Maybe it's not always critical, but someone who has that wisdom from a different perspective in the field. And it, you know, another point I would make is that it's helpful to have a network of those mentors that have diverse perspectives. So I would have, I think, you know, having more than one mentor and having different mentors at different times is also really valuable. But people who bring different experiences, different professional experiences, different lived experiences, that might be relevant to your career at different stages. So I found that really helpful as well, just, you know, having that kind of network of people.
I mean, there's a whole ton of stuff in there, Megan, which reminds me of why it doesn't have to be the ASME training program. Obviously, it's wonderful and so on, but any mentoring training, I've been involved in setting up and delivering some myself in different organizations in the past. But you're right, that there are a load of principles that you touched on there about somebody who can maybe hold up a mirror to you. Bob was talking about helping you think and reflect. Maybe at times giving advice, although it's mostly a relatively non-directive process, but at times there might be an element of that. But that thing you talked about challenge and the mentee giving permission to challenge, and the mentor being able to bring a degree of challenge, I think for me is a really interesting feature of mentorship, and is one of the ways that the relationship can go wrong if you get that bit wrong. So if the mentee has kind of withheld that permission and perceives the challenge negatively, or something that sort of almost sparks a conflict type response in them or something, or if it's done clumsily, I guess. So yeah, the dynamics of that can be really interesting. Anna, sorry, you've been really patient. You raised your hand as I was asking my long rambling question, but I saw you nodding during some of that as well. So would you like to come in?
Oh, hello. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for organising this. It's a very interesting and important topic. My name is Anna. I'm one of the junior doctors in Yorkshire. Thank you for all your reflections, Megan and Bob. My question was, I think it was at the ASME annual meeting where there was somebody presenting about mentorship, and one of the interesting points that they made that I've sort of been reflecting on ever since was about when the mentorship is supposed to last for a period of time. It's not supposed to be sort of lifelong, or it's not supposed to continue. And I think when you're in a position where you're working on a project, or when you're progressing through your training, mentoring will naturally sort of happen and end when that project finishes. But when you've got mentors from sort of different areas in your life, how do you know when it's perhaps the time to kind of end that relationship? Because it's something that they've mentioned during the talk, and I've never really kind of, you know, known how to do, or how to realize that, you know, it's come to a natural end when it's not like a preset project that you're working on, if that makes sense.
It's a great point, Anna. It's so often said in mentor training is that mentoring should have a purpose, and often that's time limited, and you should have a way of being able to identify when the relationship has kind of run its course and so on. But Megan was talking about a more complex kind of web or network of mentor-mentee relationships, almost like an ecosystem. So Megan, therefore,
Yeah, no, I'm happy to jump in there. And I think my experience with that, Anna, is that I've had mentors where they definitely have provided mentorship on something specific, but the relationship has evolved and we've become friends, and then therefore we have kept in touch, and as more like friendly colleagues, or as friends, as you know, as we would all understand that. And I think there's something to be said about what that boundary of mentoring is. Sometimes that's something that I find challenging as somebody who's newer to becoming a mentor, is knowing what that professional boundary is. You know, what's the boundary between being a mentor and a friend to somebody, a mentor and a colleague to somebody. I think it's really challenging. I mean, personally, I would say that, you know, if you've got a good relationship with somebody, you don't have to cut it off just because mentoring needs to be time limited. I think, you know, by all means, it's helpful to have that network of contacts. And the way that I maybe dice it, and Bob please come in and kind of pick me up on this if this isn't kind of correct or relevant, is that the sort of the formal mentoring relationships, for sure, it's really helpful to have a kind of contract at the start of that relationship that lays out what your expectations of each other are. And that could, it's kind of helpful to have that down on paper. I know that feels a bit strange and formal, but to have that down on paper, and then that would kind of specify the length of time that mentoring relationship was going to run for, or when you were going to review it and say, do we still need this sort of formal relationship to be there, versus the informal relationships that can be a little bit more of a snowball and sort of last for a longer period of time. So for sure, the formal relationships is helpful to set out that expectation at the start. For the informal ones, when you're developing a kind of organic relationship with somebody on the ward, you're not going to go up to them and say, well, just to check in 10 months' time, we're not going to be talking to each other anymore. That would be really odd, wouldn't it? But for the formal ones, it's helpful. Bob, please pick me up on that.
Oh, well, that implies there's right answers and there are wrong answers. And I think because this is people, it's entirely dependent on the people involved. I agree entirely with Megan that if you're starting a new formal mentoring relationship, it's well worth drawing boundaries. And I think it is well worth writing in a point for reflection. Have we done the work we set out to do? Have we still got work to do? Is there someone else who's better suited to do this work with you? But that doesn't mean that you need to break off all contact. I have one mentee whose relationship with me has changed quite dramatically over the last 6 months, because he's now submitted his PhD. He's now thinking about his next steps as a postdoc. And we've now moved from sort of supporting him as a PhD student to very much his emergence as a young and new academic. But what I'm doing with him is actually quite circumscribed, much more circumscribed than it was earlier, because it's how to survive the job hunt. And I know that he's talking with other people, and I'm supporting him to talk with other people. So I think I wouldn't be prescriptive or proscriptive about durations of relationships, but I would encourage people to review the relationships and the function on a not necessarily a regular basis, but certainly at time points. You look as though you're nodding. My readings, your body language, or at least your head and neck language, was that you didn't totally agree with the position that the speaker took.
No, not at all. I think that's really great. I think there are different, like Megan sort of spoke about having different networks, and sometimes mentoring can naturally progress into a different, like take a different form where you continue the connection or continue sort of speaking to the person. So no, completely agree with that. I think the only kind of not difficulty, but something that I'd find maybe new, so maybe perhaps I just need to kind of reflect on my own mindset of this, is actually writing it all down on paper and actually drawing up not a contract, but setting out goals in a formal mentorship, because it's not something that I think is done wildly anyway, in my experience. But hearing to your reflections and your experience, it sounds like certainly something that I'll definitely reflect on and try doing going forward.
You used an interesting word there. You used widely. Do you mean in very different ways, or in chaotic and perhaps uncivilized ways? It was just a word you used.
Sorry. No, I probably just meant in terms of
very different ways.
I guess what I meant by that was that I probably was relating that to like mentoring in a workplace, where in clinical settings, when I first, for example, meet with my educational supervisor or my clinical supervisor, do you see what I mean? Whilst we can set
lots of different places.
For like my training, it's a completely different setting. I wouldn't necessarily think about what I'm actually expecting to get from my educational supervisor as a mentor. So that's quite an interesting point going forward.
You may wish to come to the third one in the series. which is how to get the best from your consultant.
Excellent, thank you.
Just
Thank you, folks. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things in there, not least to do with the issue of rapport, which again, I don't know if Bob or Megan have any thoughts about, but there's almost in some ways like a Goldilocks zone of rapport that you need to be in to have a mentoring relationship work well. So you need enough rapport that the relationship is warm and natural and engaging and something that you look forward to participating in. And yet it's maybe false to say you can have too much rapport, but you know what I mean, where a mentoring relationship can become a friendship essentially, and where you lose that maybe ability to challenge and to reflect back and so on. It's not to say that you can't have a friend who's a mentor. So for example, I've got a very good work colleague. I would say maybe I would still probably describe them as that rather than a friend per se, but I can and sometimes we just chat and shoot the breeze and be silly and whatever. Sometimes I sense, so they're a qualified coach. Sometimes I sense that when they're responding to me in a certain way, they're kind of doing their coaching thing. And so I notice that, and so I sort of then respond accordingly. So sometimes it's about changing gear, changing mode or something. And like when are we doing friend stuff, or when are we doing chit chat, and when are we doing our coaching, mentoring, that kind of thing. And there might not be an end to that actually, so that might be episodic and occur on a needs must basis. It's not as formal as a relationship beginning or ending, or are we done now, and so on. But it's, as Bob was saying, it's messy, it's people.
But on the subject of rapport, it is something that one of my anxieties is a relationship that becomes collusive. It's when the mentor, if I think it's possible to become too engaged with the world of the other, and your world becomes their world, and you are no longer the external eye, the external voice, the external view. And I think that's one thing to guard against. And both as if you think your mentor is becoming collusive, or if you are concerned that as a mentee, you're becoming your relationship with your mentee is becoming collusive, I think that's a time for review. But it's difficult when that happens.
Sure. I think that's a great point, Bob. The question in the chat, so I tried to buy you and Megan a bit of time as well. So Jay's asked a barnstormer of a question, which is, can you mentor from afar? And has given a few examples. So maybe by reading books, is that mentoring? Maybe following their methods and seeking to emulate what they have done, or maybe even to the point of intermittent or infrequent contact. Is that mentoring? Is that a mentoring relationship? To what extent might we say it is or isn't?
Shall I go?
Everyone else is taking a step back.
It's a very important question, and I would split it into two parts. Is it possible to mentor from afar? Yes, I don't think you need to be geographically in the same area, same place. That one thing we've discovered since 2020 is the world has shrunk, and the world is our neighborhood, and there's absolutely no reason to collaborate and work with people who are quite literally on the other side of the world. So it is possible to mentor from afar, but I feel personally that does require the interpersonal, the personal interaction. I would be very concerned if somebody were to read what I wrote or what I've written and try to become another me. Partly because I think I'm a very flawed human being, and anybody who wants to emulate or copy me they're taking a very dangerous path. And so emulation is something that does worry me. I think everyone should strive to be the best possible version of themselves. So by reading, certainly someone can inspire you, but I'm just concerned about feet of clay and people whose writing is inspiring, who may not be all that you think they are when you meet them. But infrequent contact, I think that mentoring can be very effective. Some of my mentoring relationships, that they can be an initial meeting, a 6-week to 2-month meeting, and then perhaps not another meeting for 9 months, depending on the contact and the content of the contact. Because we may have talked about things that that the other person needs to go away and actually do some deep thinking and deep reflection, and perhaps thinking about what or how and make the changes that we've talked about or they've decided to take. So mentoring doesn't have to be a frequent or even a particularly regular meeting. So can we mentor from afar? Yes, I can, but I do think it requires impersonal not face-to-face, but person-to-person interaction. And I think it can be done on remarkably infrequent and episodic exchanges.
Thanks. Well, what would you say, Megan?
Yeah, I think it requires a dialogue, doesn't it? So the way that I would see it, if you're reading a book or a paper and that inspires you, that's great, but that's your kind of interpretation of something that's kind of flat, right? The text is sort of flat rather than that more dynamic space of a dialogue. And I would say that I have relationships with mentors who I would see even on a video call relatively infrequently. We keep quite open lines of email communication. So I think that's another way that I found really helpful. They'll share things that I might find interesting. I might send them a question, approach them with a problem, and they'll send something back, and it can kind of tide over that relationship until the next time that you do get an opportunity to speak with somebody. But if someone inspires you and they're a key figure for you, even having that kind of that infrequent advice, and maybe it's sometimes more advice than mentoring. And that's a kind of blurry line. But I think that can still be helpful if you've got that way of connecting with them.
Sure. So it sounds like maybe it's important, not rigidly, but to be able to fit some of these things into categories. So what is teaching? What is role modeling? What is mentoring? What is advice, and so on? And so it sounds like what you're saying is mentoring is fundamentally about a relationship, even if it's an incredibly episodic and infrequent one. And some of those modalities, like writing and reading books, is not really a relationship. It's a kind of communication, I suppose, but it's not really a relationship. Okay, that's an interesting one. So I've just sort of asked for other questions. Oh, that's a cracking one. Stanley, thank you for that. So how do you handle, so it's framed here as gender issues, for example. Might not be purely gender, it might be other kind of interpersonal issues, but how do you handle those if those arise in your mentoring relationship? And that might be to do with thanks, Jay, any kind of interpersonal complications, let's say, that might arise during a mentoring relationship. So Paul's mic's open, but Megan, okay, Megan, I can see you nodding.
I don't mind if you want to go, Bob, but
no, go for it. Go for it.
So I think it's a really important question, because it's very rare that you would find a mentor that exactly shares your perspective, and also that's probably not that helpful, because then you're not going to have so many moments of challenge and of a fresh set of eyes on your perspective. So I think it can be, I think where the challenge arises, where you have interpersonal differences. So, for example, so I'm a woman, I'm disabled, I have mentors that are neither of those things. And I think that the challenge arises is when you see the world differently, and that leads to a conflict in perspectives or advice. So maybe your mentor might say something, maybe they'll give a bit of advice within that mentoring relationship that you think, oh, I don't want to do that. Or I'm not sure why you're asking me that question, or I don't want to, maybe I don't want to answer that question. And I think it's important sometimes to take a step back in those situations and try and think a little bit about the your perspective and experiences and how that's informing your response, but also what your mentor's background experiences are and how that's informing their perspectives. And I think if you can be open, again, it's about communication. I think if you can be open with each other in those conversations, in terms of where you're coming from, if you've got the trust and the rapport where you can ask clarification, you can ask for clarification, why is it that you think that? Can you tell me a little bit more about where that question came from? And if you're open to that constructive dialogue with each other, I think that you can work through to understand where each other's coming from. And as a mentee, not be it's about balancing that respect of the advice and of the perspective of your mentor with your own judgment as well. So you don't have to you can still move forward with what you think is best. In that situation, it's not that it's very much a two-way street, and you're learning from each other. You don't have to just take what is said and move forward with that and with any recommendations that are made. So I think, trying to understand where each other's coming from, trusting your own judgments, and being open to having those dialogues with each other and learning from each other can be very helpful in those situations where there is a difference. I've been talking for long enough now, so I'm going to stop.
No, Megan, thank you for that. I guess what I should acknowledge here is that so you've handled the question as it was asked. I interpreted gender issues as codified because in the many workshops I've run on mentoring over the years, when a question has been framed in this way, what it often means, and I'm not suggesting, Stanley, this is what you meant. I'm owning up to my own probable misinterpretation. What that question has often meant when this issue has come up in workshops is if I am a cisgendered heterosexual man and my mentoring partner, whether that's mentor or mentee, is a cisgendered heterosexual woman, is there a potential there for that relationship to develop in a way which initially is exactly as intended and whatever else, and then is at risk of either becoming something else or looking like it's becoming something else to other significant people in our lives. And so we've got into a conversation there about boundary issues, about when mentoring can or should happen. So how available are you as a mentor? And that that question bleeds across into mentoring in general. Just because you're someone's mentor, can they phone you at midnight on a Friday if they're struggling with something in life, or can they contact you at the weekend, or what are the rules of engagement around mentoring, and especially if those might then be complicated by other interpersonal things. So I apologize, Stanley, that I began to interpret your question that way. Sorry, Megan, for sort of almost reframing it.
No, that's okay. Sorry if I took it off in a kind of tangent or a different direction, but I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think that's why the contract helps, right? Like to have some more of those formal, not rules, but you've got something really helpful when I've had mentoring relationships with students. How often are we going to what's the time frame for an email communication? When are you going to follow up and chase me on an email? And I think also helpful, especially for people who are more junior and kind of entering the field and don't necessarily know the lay of the land, or those kind of the hidden ways of working within academia and the hidden conventions, to have it spelled out on paper and you've got something to fall back on. So I think it can, if you frame it in that way, it's helpful for both parties in terms of setting those boundaries, but also demystifying some of the rules of engagement that those of us who've been in the field for a while will just take as intuitive when they're not.
Yeah. And it's easy, isn't it, Meg? Especially if you're in that helping mode, to think, well, my door should always be open. This person might need me, and you get sort of scope creep or mission creep. And you've touched on.
It's well intentioned. It's well intentioned, of course it is. We all want to help one another when people have those moments that are a great challenge to them. But equally, you're right. I think it's about what the relationship is and what it isn't. It is also then kind of, if you can set out what it is implied within that formal contract. Yeah.
And super important, as you're saying, when there are hierarchies and power imbalances. So if it's teacher student or consultant trainee or whatever, that can be worth paying attention to as well. Bob, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, this has been absolutely fascinating, and it just shows that what looks like a simple question can become incredibly embedded in the who asks and who answers. And I had thought of this well, not completely differently, but differently. And it was really about, and my thinking when you asked the question, Stanley, was very much about difference. That it's not just gender, it's culture, whether that's ethnic or socioeconomic, whether it's your disciplinary background, there's all about difference. And to look at me, I am in many ways, a stereotypical academic. I'm white, I've got white hair, I've got a beard, I've got glasses. I am the stereotyped academic. The only thing I don't have is patches on my elbows. Whereas, and one of the things that I do practically when I am working with people who are visibly but also potentially invisibly different, is that I apologize in advance that I may say something which is you find difficult or challenging or inappropriately challenging, and I invite and I try to keep checking to make sure that the person I'm working with is comfortable. And the flip side is I invite, if I ever say anything that you think is inappropriate, please challenge me, because I can't believe I would ever say anything offensive deliberately. And if it is offensive, I need to know so I don't do it again. I need to know so that I learn, because I've learned from every single mentee that I've worked with. So it is a mutual relationship. And I had not thought about, if you like, the sexual side of gender difference at all. So it was a completely different concern. And but it's interesting. It is a challenge. But what I would invite any mentee is to challenge the mentor if he or she or they say something that you find difficult.
Can I just add to that? I think that's a really important point. And we had a conversation actually just before the call started about some recent literature about cross-cultural mentoring. And I think part of that is, yes, creating that environment where a mentee is able to challenge something that is said, but also the mentor working on their own skills in that area. So, keeping engaged with literature, attending relevant events and training on cross-cultural mentoring, on appropriate terminology across a wide variety of EDI issues. So I think creating that environment is an important step. Also, the mentors taking on that, as Bob said, it's a learning relationship. It's a space for learning, and the way that you get the most out of that relationship is by each of you doing the homework. You expect the mentee to come prepared to that mentoring relationship. You expect them to bring something to work on, or possibly things that they're interested in working towards. And similarly, the mentor, we used a mirror earlier on, and I use that term, and it's probably not fair, because you're not a blank slate. The mentor equally needs to work on their own craft in mentoring, and a really important part of that pertains to EDI and making sure that approach to mentoring is inclusive, and that you have the skill set to kind of work across differences.
Mike also alluded to when relationships become difficult, and that's something that I'm not going to. I'm not deluded. Some mentoring relationships are difficult, and that's when perhaps structures are important. And for example, within our mentoring process in ASME, because I have charge of it, I am here for people who feel that that relationships are becoming difficult or fraught or for whatever reason. So you can, and I would encourage you, sometimes you need to take it outside the dyadic relationship between the mentor and the mentee. So sometimes a third voice, a third eye is necessary.
Which is interesting, Bob, isn't it? So when you're setting up a mentor scheme, for example, there's something about the responsibility of the people setting it up and the governance of the scheme. Does your mentor have a mentor, for example? Because they'll be learning through their own mentoring experience and may run into difficulties that they've not encountered before. So what is the support for them? If you're the mentor, what's the support for you if things start to go awry? So we're in the last few minutes now at this point. Stanley's asked a follow-up question, a different one this time though. So how do you access technical support for a mentee in a discipline you're not too familiar with? And again, either Bob or Megan.
I have an answer.
Yeah.
I would, if for example, I were mentoring someone who was a psychometrician, and I don't know a great deal. I know a little bit. I don't know a huge amount about psychometrics. As far as I'm concerned, my mentee is the expert in the room, and he or she or they are the source of the technical expertise. If they have a problem, if there's something they don't know, I feel my job is to help them identify the routes they have to find the answers. And I spend some time with most mentees thinking about their expertise and what they bring into the room. And quite often it's holding a mirror, to use Megan's analogy, holding up a mirror and seeing the agency and the power that the mentee has and supporting, encouraging, enabling them to use that agency that they already possess. It's a non-answer, but it's my answer.
Thank you, Bob. Megan, what would you say?
Yeah, I think Bob's right, and I think again, it's back to that setting expectations in terms of this is what I can offer as a mentor. This is what my disciplinary background is. It's where my professional connections are. Is that helpful? Is the specific purpose to provide that technical support? If so, maybe I'm not the best mentor to do that specifically. Could I put you in touch with somebody who might be better suited and better placed to do that? Or if you're moving into that space and you need to develop those skills, attending those events and developing, your own network and your own. So I'm thinking within medical education, obviously we work across professions, not just attending kind of medical conferences, having a presence at dental conferences, that sort of thing, and kind of broadening the network and therefore your access to that support as a mentor that way. So back to that kind of your own professional development as a mentor.
And how would you feel, Megan? So I mean, you're here as a mentor and a mentee, but from the mentee perspective, if you get a response like the one that Bob's describing, are you happy with that? Do you understand that as valid? If your mentor's role there is to actually ask you the question, so how could you find out what you might need to know in order to get this done?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that is fair and helpful, and I think people often have more thoughts and knowledge than you realize on that topic, as a process of kind of discovering that and finding that out together, possibly up to a point. I'm wondering, but I might not be interested in accessing that technical support if I hadn't already got a foundation or a knowledge or as to why I need that and how did I discover that I need that. So you can kind of think backwards a bit. If it was something that I absolutely had and I needed, but I had no experience or clue in, it might be about finding a way around that brick wall, and maybe there's ways to do that as a partnership as well, rather than just finding the support and handing it out. But I think that is a helpful approach.
Thanks, Megan. And just Jenny was posting in the chat about any of the tips that we've offered, maybe, or that you've been able to extract from some of the stuff that we've been saying about setting up a scheme. So we were talking there about I guess governance in a way. It's never a very exciting word, but then once you're responsible for something, you realize how important it is. And we were talking there in the context of support, so support for mentors, maybe also support for mentees when those relationships are starting to go wrong, and also what are the lines of communication if somebody wants to raise a concern. So we've sort of skirted around the idea of relationships maybe being inappropriate or difficult things happening. I mean, I'm glad we've not dwelled on that, but the real life scenario is that these things can arise. So what are the channels via which somebody might be able to raise a concern? So when I helped set up a mentoring scheme, it was a national one with the Royal College of Physicians. One of the things we figured out pretty quickly was that we should have some sort of steering group or governance committee to whom concerns could be escalated. We were working with medics, and so we wanted a medical director there to bring that sort of element of accountability and responsibility to the process. So some of those things are worth thinking about. Okay, folks. I mean, it's been a really enjoyable conversation from my point of view. The feedback we're getting from the chat is that people have enjoyed it. So the temptation is to let it roll on. However, I need to respect people's time. So we're now 47 minutes past the hour, and we said it would be a 45-minute session approximately. So we'll draw things to a close at this point. Just to say thank you for participating in the various ways that you've participated today. We will make a video of the session available on the website. It'll take us a few days to edit that and get it ready. So have a look out for it. There is another bite-sized session coming up. It's on Wednesday, the 29th of November. And it's about how to get the most from your research supervisor. Maybe some of the themes will copy across, I don't know, but let's see. But it's there if you'd like to access that one. If you want more details about that or any other ASME events, go to the ASME events page, which is there on the homepage. And if you click on events, that will take you to the full range of things that we have on offer. So thanks to Bob and Megan for being our panel today. Thank you for everyone who's joined us and contributed, or even just listened and enjoyed it all. So thank you, folks.
Thank you, everyone.